let's look at the concept of identity. What do we mean by identity? In layman's language, identity is my own self-concept of who I am, my idea of who I am. That's my identity. Yeah, so we're talking about self-identity here. So what is it? Well, how is it created? How is it constructed? Well, it's constructed throughout our life. We pick it up from all the cues that we gather from all the people whom we influence with, all these situations and experiences that we go through, all the stuff that people and media tell us, the books we read, the interactions we have. And over time, we build up a huge set of associations, ideas and beliefs related to who I am. So one way of talking about identities that really resonated with me, and this comes from the psychological literature really, is when identity is described as a parliament of cells within us. So we all have multiple identities, and it's not a personality disorder that I'm talking about, but it's just we have several associations that we have about ourselves with different prototypes or ideas, for example. And these are all nested within one another, and they could be different as well. For example, look at me. I mean, if I were to say, start building out, teasing, some of the major identities that I have, so I could say, okay, I'm a woman, I'm a professor, I'm a basketball player, I'm a yoga teacher, I'm an Indian, I'm an Asian, I'm a human being, I'm a poet. Yeah, so it goes on. I'm a mother, I'm a wife. Now I have all these identities, all these associations, and they're all there in my head. And they might have relative strengths, yeah, or related hierarchy. Now let's see the heuristics that operate in my mind about which of these identities become salient in which context. So now that I'm recording this video about psychology, or when I go into a class, which identity do you think is most salient? I'm a professor, right? That's salient, that drives my behavior, that drives my body language, that drives the way I'm talking, that drives the kind of stuff, ideas that are associated, that I have easy access to. That's the heuristic that I talked about. So my mind is actually helping me out because I don't have to think about a whole lot of unrelated things. I'm not thinking about myself as a basketball player or a trekker or a yoga teacher or a poet or a mother right now. I'm thinking of myself as a professor, and that identity is salient, and that gives me access to certain resources in my mind, certain behaviors, certain body language, certain ways of speaking. So if you come and visit me at home, and if you see me at home and I'm interacting with my son, and you can already start noticing the shift in my body language as I talk about my son, right? You'll see a very different person. So I have one son who's 6 years old, but usually I have about 5 or 6 children in my living room playing, especially on holidays, and that's because I love hanging out with kids, and the kids in my street, they love hanging out at home because we have a lot of fun and do fun things together. And you'll see a very different person. You'll see a different body language. You'll see a different sorts of ideas coming up, access to different thoughts and resources. Yeah, different kinds of things that literally influence my actions and my behavior. Why does this happen? This is just efficiency, right? So we are just like bounded awareness was also a form of functional efficiency for human beings to, process the huge sea and ocean of information that is available to all of us in the universe. This is also our own way of efficiently processing all the associations and ideas and beliefs that we actually have to aid us in our behavior, but to make them context relevant. Now these cues are happening quite automatically. I sort of wear certain clothes, come into this classroom, and I don't have to tell myself, Ramya, for the next 2 hours, think of yourself as a professor. No, it's happening automatically, right? And I go home and I, dump my books, and the kids come in, and then we start playing some music, and then I don't have to say, Ramya, think of yourself as a mother, right? It just happens very automatically. Now this automaticity is something that we're going to challenge a little. And what I'm going to suggest to you is, yes, it does happen automatically. And when we say something happens automatically, it just means it's happening very fast. But we can influence this process a little. We can exert our conscious will into this process. So we can choose to actively make a certain identity stronger in a certain situation or a certain context, right? And how can we do this? We can do this by making ourselves remember past events that are relevant to the context or help us. We can do this by affirming our identity in a particular way. We can do this in several ways. And can this change the can this change our efficiency? Can this change our productivity? Can this change our behavior? Can this drive us to work in ways that we might have not had access to behave in if we had not taken on this identity A versus identity B? Absolutely. And I'm going to not just tell this to you, but give you evidence. Yeah, so we're lucky actually to be in an era where we have tons and tons of very interesting psychological experiments. And we have an experiment. I'm going to talk to you about an experiment that does just this. So the experiment I'm going to narrate to you is known as the Asian Women Experiment, but it's fascinatingly designed, and to me it's a very, very clever experiment. So this experiment was conducted in the United States, and it was conducted on Asian women who are resident in the West. These were students, and they were invited into the lab for an experiment, and they were divided into two groups, right? Randomly assigned into two groups. One group was attended to by a group of, so they were by researchers who were Asian, and they had pictures of Asian things. So they were told that they were studying, they were told, primed, and that's the language we use in psychology, to think of them as Asians in different ways. So they were told that this is a study about Asians, we're looking at Asian culture, ask questions about Asian things and all. So all these participants were really, identified with being Asian. So you can see what they manipulated, right? So all these participants have an identity of being Asian, and they also have an identity of being women, right? They all, of course, they have several other identities, but these were the two identities that were being compared in this experiment. So in group one, the experimental in one group, the Asian identity was primed. They were made to think of themselves as Asians. In group two, the women identity of being a woman was primed. How was this done? So, the researchers told the participants in the second group that we're studying women, this is something about women, there were pictures of women around, they were showing videos about women, asked questions about women and all of that. So they all talked about womanly things, and they bonded over the fact that they were women. So the woman identity was primed, right? Now both these groups were given a maths test, as part of the experiment after all this priming was done. And by priming, I just mean which identity was made more salient, consciously. So Asian identity, woman identity. And both these groups of participants were given the same maths exam. So they went through these exams, and then the results, the mean scores of these maths tests were, compared. Now the two groups of students were randomly distributed, right? So there's no reason to expect that one group would score more than the other, unless it was because of the priming, because we were comparing mean scores. Now, what the researchers found was that the group that was primed to think of themselves as Asians did much better in the test, statistically significantly better. The mean was statistically significantly more than the mean of this group. What do you think the reason for that was? The researchers were really trying to link, see if their identity would influence performance, and they were banking on the fact that all these participants, or at least a huge majority of them, would have somewhere in their minds had these basic associations or models of the cultural stereotypes that we're all part of. So part of our mental models, a lot of them are soaked in from the culture, right? And that's what stereotypes are. Stereotypes are collective beliefs that we hold as a society. And there are two powerful stereotypes out there regarding women. You may or may not believe that individually that these might be true, but the stereotypes are out there, and to the extent that we sort of buy into society, to some extent, right, these stereotypes play out in all our minds. So some of us, they might be a little weaker, some of us, they might be stronger, but they're there, lurking in the background somewhere. So one stereotype is that women are not as good in maths as men, that women are not great at maths. Another stereotype out there, and these are just stereotypes, they're beliefs, okay, so by no means am I saying that this is true, is that Asians are good at maths compared to Westerners. Asians are good. So the researchers were really banking upon the fact, they wanted to test if, so there's two linkages here, right? So the participants who were primed to think of themselves as Asians, so the Asian identity is primed, and the Asian identity is linked somewhere in their mind. Their glass had crashed, was linked in the previous experiment like that. Asian is linked with good in maths, and therefore what happens? The linkage goes, I am linked with Asian, Asian is linked with good at maths, so I am good at maths. So the belief that was primed here by just priming the Asian identity was that they're good at maths. Here the belief was, I am a woman, women are not good at maths, so I am not good at maths. I am not so good at maths. Just the power and influence of these beliefs landed up creating the mean differences in these responses in the maths exam. 6 months later, the same participants were invited back, swapped. The roles were swapped. These participants were made to think of themselves as women. These participants were made to think of themselves as Asians. Given another similar maths exam, again, results were repeated. Now, usually in experiments, you don't need to do the reverse swap. You don't need that because you are randomly distributing the participants, and any difference would be, which is a statistical difference between the means, could easily be attributed only to the priming difference in what was primed. But in this experiment, they just did this double check as well. So that is a very fascinating result to me, just how the priming of an identity can land up influencing your actions. How does that happen? Through what the same process that we talked about, the self-fulfilling prophecy, except that here now we're no longer looking at ourselves as the victims of all the models that we hold in our minds. We're telling ourselves that there might be models that work to our advantage, mental models. There might be beliefs and mental models that don't work to our advantage. But hey, you know what? We can actually start getting quite creative, quite interested, but we also have to be very self-aware about this, right? To consciously reaffirm and bring into our own awareness and into our conscious minds the ones that we want to live out and play out in our existence.